my name is Lisa Malstrom, and Jon and I decided that his expertise is change management. He's a professional change manager, so he's going to take the session on change management, and I'm just crazy about our student ministry at Real Life Texas, and have done a lot of the work in raising our 2 children ourselves, and so I'm going to take the session on discipling the next generation. So you guys are listening to me for the next 45 minutes or whatever that is. I will tell you, for those of you who weren't here the last couple of days, I'm on staff with Pastor Brandon. My official title is Discipleship Coordinator. But because we are a church plant, I do lots of other things. I do our social media, I do a lot of our design, I order the t-shirts, I clean the bathrooms, I sweep the floors, I make sure that there's water on Sunday mornings and coffee, and I'm also newly the director of women's discipleship, and I'm super excited about that and getting ready to start some exciting things with the women of our church. So I wear a lot of different hats at Real Life Texas. Previous to that, I was on staff at a very large Baptist church. You guys would call it a mega church. We had ran about 2,500, 3,000 on a Sunday morning, had about 4,000 members. And I was the discipleship resources coordinator there and wrote curriculum and small group leader training. And prior to that, I was on staff for about 8 years. So prior to that, I was in charge of the baptism and membership process for a while. I helped launch the second campus. So I've done a number of different things in ministry. One of the things that I've been really excited about at Real Life Texas is the opportunity to work with one of my very dear friends, Tommy Robertson. And he is our associate pastor, and right this minute, he's also our student pastor. And that's what we call youth ministry in the States. I don't know if that's a term that you guys are familiar with, but that's what you'll hear me call it, because I've had to retrain myself over the years to call it student ministry, not youth ministry. So that's what you guys will hear me call it. And that's our kids that are in 6th grade through high school in the U.S., so that's about age 11 to 18-ish. And so that's primarily who I'm going to focus on, but the information that we're going to talk about also applies to sort of the next group of young people, which are those who are in college, kind of the 18 to 22 age group, and then even some of the ones going into what we sort of call the millennials, in that sort of 22 to 26, 27, 28 age group as well. I will say that I could just simply say to you what Brandon said, drop the mic and walk off, because people are people and all need exactly the same thing. Disciple making works the same way for younger people as it does for older people. So I could say that, but I won't, because I like to have the microphone and I like to be on stage. But I want to start by telling you about my friend Emma. And you guys have heard about Emma because she's Pastor Brandon's oldest daughter. She's 16 years old. And Emma and I have had a great relationship over the years that the Guindons have lived in Houston. She and I like to go to Bahama Bucks together. Bahama Bucks is a place where we go and we get shaved ice, and they have a bunch of different flavors you can put on it. And Emma likes to have a scoop of ice cream in hers. And in Texas, we have ice cream called Bluebell. And it's like gold. It's the best. And for a while, in the last couple of years, Bluebell had some problems and they couldn't produce Bluebell ice cream. And you would have thought the world was coming to an end in Texas because we couldn't have our Bluebell ice cream. What were we going to do? Most people chose just not to eat ice cream if they couldn't have Bluebell. So it really harmed the ice cream industry. But now we have our Bluebell back, and so Emma and I can go get our shaved ice with a scoop of Bluebell. So we've had fun doing things like that throughout the year. Jon and I have gone to some of her softball games to be able to watch her pitch and enjoy seeing her do what she loves to do and what she's so good at. And on October 28th, which was a Friday last fall, I had my phone out and I was using an app that I love called Waze, trying to figure out how to get to a particular softball complex so that we could watch Emma and Olivia play in the Ronald McDonald tournament. And so I was standing in our family room And we had eaten and we'd gotten our shorts on and we were ready to go. And I'm trying to figure out how do we get to the Ronald McDonald tournament. And I get a text on my phone. I'm like, okay, I can't do this with the map if people keep texting me. And I got another text and I thought, okay, I better read and see what's going on. It was my friend Judy, and she said, the girls have been in an accident. Call me. And so I called Judy, and she didn't know a whole lot at the time. But Pastor Brandon's daughters, for those of you who haven't been here the last couple of days, Emma and Olivia. Emma's 16, she was driving the car. Olivia is 14, and she was the passenger, and probably hollering at her sister because they were late for the tournament or whatever. But on their way to their softball tournament, they were in a car accident. They were hit by a very large pickup truck. We have a lot of those in Texas. Men are very proud of them. But it did a lot of damage to the car, and it very seriously injured both of the girls. So Pastor Brandon was on his way to watch them play in the tournament, and he got the news that they'd been in an accident, and he turned his car around, and their family headed toward the emergency room. Jon and I hopped in our car, and we headed toward the emergency room, and we got there a little bit after they did. And as you know from hearing Pastor Brandon speak, Olivia was life-flighted from that hospital to a hospital downtown, and I will never forget watching that helicopter take off. I will never forget the fear and the dread in my heart and the pleas to God to save that child's life, watching that helicopter fly directly over my head. The next thing that happened was that we were in the middle of planting a church. We were about to launch in 10 days. And we have a small staff, and we have a small but mighty team of leaders and volunteers. So we were working many, many hours to try to get our church building ready, to try to get our services ready, to be sure we were inviting people to come to our first church service. We had been focusing completely on that, and there were several things already that had hit our congregation. There were some relational issues that had happened. There were some serious health issues that had happened, and now these girls who we all loved, our pastor's girls, were in this car accident. Well, of course, we immediately came around him that Friday night. When Olivia was flown downtown, her mom went with her. She wasn't allowed to go in the helicopter, but a couple of other friends of ours drove her downtown, and she was with Olivia. Pastor Brandon stayed out in the woodlands in our area of town with Emma. Well, because a girl needs a lady with her, she needs somebody to mama her. There were a couple of us ladies that were there with her, and that first night in the emergency room, there were two of us that were sitting with her holding her hand while they stitched up her ear. She was the bravest girl I have ever seen. I was so proud of her because that was just an incredible thing to go through, and she was just phenomenal. So I was there with her at the emergency room. Jon was with Pastor Brandon with a couple of other leadership guys in the waiting room. But I was with my Emma girl. And I was so thankful that I had a relationship with her, that we'd shared some fun times over our Bahama Bucks, shaved snow, and Bluebell ice cream. Because I knew her heart, and I knew that she felt safe with me, and she felt comfortable with me and a couple of the other ladies that were there with her. And then she was in the hospital for a week, and her mom wasn't able to be with her. Now, her dad was with her very consistently, and I will tell you what, Pastor Brandon is an incredible man of God. He's an incredible father. I watched him, as torn up as he was himself, the way that he was with Emma in particular was just amazing. He would pray with her, he would calm her. And he read in the Psalms, the first night or second night, the days kind of run together because we didn't sleep very much. But he read in the Psalms that God's word heals. And so he began reading scripture aloud over Emma. And it was the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen in my life. And then when he would grow tired, he would hand me his Bible and say, "Can you read over her?" And I would read over her. And then I would grow tired, and I would hand it to my friend Ashley, who was there, and Ashley would read scripture over her. And so we read the healing word of the Lord over Emma. And so John and I were on what we called Team Emma. We had Team Emma and Team Olivia. So we had some people that spent a lot of time downtown with Amber and with Olivia. They didn't get to see her because she was in ICU, but we had that team down there, and then we had Team Emma out in the Woodlands. And Team Emma was fun because I got to actually be with Emma on a regular basis. And I was there the day that they decided to wash her hair. Now, you guys haven't met Emma, but Emma has a mane of hair. This girl has long, thick, wonderful, beautiful hair. And because she was in the accident, it was not clean and it was matted, and she'd been in bed for several days. And so washing this child's hair was quite a task, let me tell you. And because they were trying to be real careful, she'd had a serious concussion, trying to be real careful with her head, they decided the best way to do it would be to put her in the shower and for the nurse and myself to go in there with her and wash her hair. So the nurse's job was stabilizing Emma so that she didn't fall, and my job was washing her hair. Well, I did a wonderful job of completely soaking all three of us. But we got Emma's hair clean, and then we got her out and we got her in bed, and Emma said, okay, we've got to comb it out while it's wet or it'll just be a mess. And I was like, okay, where's your comb? And she's like, well, I don't know. I don't have my comb. We're like, okay, so the nurse brought us a comb. It was this big and about this wide, and it had these tiny, tiny little teeth. Well, friends, that was not the right comb to use for Emma's hair, but we ended up with about 3 of them, and the nurse and I started at the bottom and worked our way through that girl's hair. So, man, we spent a bunch of time together just getting her hair combed, but it was sweet, precious, wonderful time. And then as Emma healed a little bit, she was not allowed, she was on concussion protocol, so she was not allowed to watch TV, she was not allowed to have her phone, which for a teenager, I thought that in and of itself might kill her. But eventually, Brandon allowed us to read her texts to her because her friends were texting her like crazy. We had 300 backlog by the time he said, okay, you guys can read her texts to her. So we would read her texts to her, and Ashley and I spent a lot of time doing that. Ashley's my good friend. And we would be by her bedside, and we'd be like, ooh, who's this? Ooh, well, does she like her? And how does this work? And well, now, is this the boyfriend that she's talking about? Who's that guy? And so it was a lot of fun. It was like a grand novel for us to enter into the relationships of these teenagers. But the names that kept coming up were like, I don't really understand the names of your friends, Emma. And so she explained to us that her friends were Brock, which is a girl. Her name's actually, her first name, the name that her mother gave her is Caitlin, but she goes by Brock. Then there's Bug. Her name is also Caitlin. She goes by Bug. I don't have any idea where that came from yet. Her last name's Winkler, so where they got Bug, I don't really have any idea. And then there was Cook, and Cook's real name is Emily, I have since found out, and she's a precious little blonde girl, but they call her Cook, so I don't know. So we had all of these names, and there were all of these girls, and we were getting to know their life because we got to read the text, and then we'd reply, like, oh, what do you want to write back to Brock? And so we would reply for her. So we entered into her world, and her heart for those girls was amazing, because even though Emma was going through the most difficult circumstance that she had ever experienced in her 16 years, she was ministering to her friends. That first night in the emergency room, she looked at me at one point after they'd gotten her kind of stitched up and they'd gotten some of the glass cleaned up off of her, and she said, "Can I have a piece of paper, please?" And I said, "Absolutely, let's," we scurried around and we found her a piece of paper and a pen, and I thought she wanted to draw because she's an artist. But she wanted to write, and so she was writing, and I was trying to give her some privacy, but I'm thinking, what's she writing? I have no idea. She was writing a note about God's love and about God's peace that she wanted us to take to the guy in the next partition because she could hear that he was in a lot of pain. Y'all, this is a 16-year-old girl who's just gone through the most difficult thing in her life. And she's concerned about the guy next to her because he's in pain. And she's talking to him about the love of God. if that's not a disciple, I don't know what is. It's critical for us to reach people when they're young, because that's when they're going to be making many of their life decisions. They're going to be deciding where to go to college. They're going to be deciding who to hang out with during their most formative years. They'll be making decisions about who they're going to marry and spend the rest of their lives with. And they're influencers of our culture, aren't they? They're the ones that are really going to point us in the direction that we're going. I finally got a chance to meet Bug and Brock and Cook because they all came to student ministry with Emma and Olivia because they love Emma and Olivia. And that's probably the only reason that they came the first night, because they decided as a softball team they were going to come and support Emma and Olivia. Well, we're blessed that they've been coming back. And one night we were sitting and we were storying through Daniel, and we were talking about Daniel did his usual routine of praying 3 times a day. And even when the king enacted a law that said nobody could pray to anybody except for the king, Daniel continued his usual routine. And so some of the questions that we asked were, how did that impact the people who were around Daniel? When he broke the king's commandment and continued his usual routine. And I was just fascinated at what these girls said. They said, well, it showed who he truly was. Y'all, this is a generation that can sniff out hypocrites miles away. They know when you're being true with them. They know when you're living out what it is that you're telling them to do and when you're not. And the rest of the discussion that evening centered around, even in their high school, people that they're around on a regular basis, even adults in their lives that they knew, that they just couldn't stand it when somebody said one thing and did something else. They couldn't stand it when somebody acted one way at school and acted another way outside of school. They don't like the fake. They can't take any of that. So they take a look then at our religious structures and traditions and evaluate them based on their knowledge. Now, kids today have more knowledge than we did at their age. They have the world at their fingertips. My iPad's magneted to this. But they have their world at their fingertips with their phones. They have, we used to have encyclopedias that we had in our family room. They've got all of that available right on their phone. They can just bring it right up. So their knowledge is vast. And their worldview tends to be a little skeptical. And so they look at our religious traditions, they look at what we do in church, and they evaluate that in a very critical way. Pastor Brandon recently taught through the minor prophets, and Amos, who was a prophet and servant of God, understood what it meant to be around people who worshiped God in a routine manner, but who gathered with a desire not to encounter God, but to be there because that's what they were supposed to do, or because that's what they had always done. So when Israel was doing that, they were gathering for their traditions, they were gathering for the festivals. In Amos 5 it says, I despise your religious feasts. Well, these were feasts that God himself had enacted. But he says, I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. The young people today can sniff that out. If we're gathering and we're doing things just because it's the way we've always done it, or if we're doing things that have very little meaning, they're going to know that. They want to see sincerity, and they want to see meaning in tradition. I'm really interested that in the United States, there are a lot of young people that are very interested in sort of the churches that use very high tradition and that have a lot of high theology around them. So they are drawn to that as long as it has meaning. We don't have to water anything down for them. They're ready to engage and enter in, but it has to be for a meaningful reason, not because that's how we've always done it or because it looks good or sounds good. Young people are already very relational in nature. So we don't have to teach them to be relational, right? Emma was dying to text her friends because she's relational. Developmentally, adolescents find their identity through their relationships, and they adopt the moral values of those closest to them. Their faith tends to be very interdependent with people who they trust and people who they respect. So that's pretty good news for us in our student ministries if we have adults who are speaking truth and who are willing to invest in the lives of our kids. It's fairly alarming news if we don't have adults who are willing to invest in students. If we don't invest in students, in the young people in our generation, somebody will, right? The same is true for the millennials who are sort of just coming out of that stage. They long for connection. We live in a world where relationships tend to not be very deep. But as humans, that's what we long for that deep relationship. And so they're gonna find that relationship where they can. And we need for them to find it in a place where we care about who they are and who they love, and we care about making them into disciples who can make disciples to go out and impact the world. That's the other thing that young people today really care about, is impacting the world. And they're going to do it. They are going to find a way to do it. Our son goes to the University of Texas, which is a very large university in Austin, Texas. And the motto for the whole school is, what starts here changes the world. And I absolutely believe that's true. I've read enough stories of kids who've invented great things or discovered amazing scientific principles or have gone on to start amazing companies that came out of the University of Texas. But I'm frightened when I look at the lack of commitment to Christianity and discipleship that I see coming out of the University of Texas, because I know that what starts there changes the world. So if we can just wrap our minds around these principles that Pastor Brandon's been talking to us about and figure out how to really get our students involved, then that's the way that we can change the world for Jesus. And that's what Jesus asked us to do, right? So on the wheel, on the outside, there were some principles of share, connect, minister, and disciple. And like I said earlier, everything that Pastor Brandon talked about is exactly how we're going to disciple students, the same way that we disciple adults. So let me talk you through it and tell you a little bit about some of the uniquenesses of students. So first, we're going to begin by sharing. Students need meaningful relationships with adults who invest in their lives. So adults and more spiritually mature older students, because I told you Emma's 16, she's pouring into the kids around her. So as they mature more spiritually, it's not just the adults, but it's the other students that will be pouring into the lives of the students. They can model a life of walking with Jesus. Certainly the people around Emma saw how she walked with Jesus, and their lives were impacted by that. They can share how to have a relationship with Jesus. Some of the kids have never been brought to church before in their lives, or they've been raised in a church that wasn't teaching biblical principles and wasn't teaching about Jesus. And so it's important to be able to share that. They can share how to read the Bible, how to pray, encourage others, and they can listen with a mature perspective. A lot of times, what a teenager needs, at least in the United States, is somebody to stop in their busy world and just listen to what's going on, to listen with the intent to understand, right? So those are all components of share. One of the ways that we do that at Real Life Texas, Pastor Brandon teaches a biblical study on Saturday mornings at breakfast for the men of our church. And I was surprised but really pleased when I saw that all of the men in our church, starting at age 10 and up, were invited to that. What a beautiful way for the men to teach their boys and other boys who come and are invited that studying the Word of God is important. It's important enough to get up at 7:30 on a Saturday morning. It's important enough to hang out with older men who maybe you don't have a lot in common with. But it develops those relationships whereby the adults can speak into the lives of the boys. So now the adult men in our congregation have friendships with the younger boys in our congregation. And so when something's going on, they're not afraid to go talk to somebody about it. Sometimes kids need to talk to somebody who's not their mom or dad, right? Sometimes mom and dad are not the best person to talk to. So how amazing to have a whole group of men that you're comfortable with and have studied God's word with that you can go and ask a question of. The next thing we want to do is connect. Students need to be connected to each other. They like that. They need to be connected to a relational small group, and they need to be connected to a local church body, a community of believers. When connecting students, there are three critical elements: time, proximity, and consistency. And I'm telling you what, consistency, in my mind right this minute, is one of the most important. Because it comes back to that whole kids being skeptical thing. If they see that you're there sometimes, but you're not there other times, you're too busy for them, they're going to sniff that out. They know what's going on. But if you're consistent, if you're there for them, they know they can count on you. It comes back to a matter of trust. And when they can trust you, better things are going to happen. So consistency is important. I've said this a couple of times, and you guys have heard Pastor Brandon and even John talk about it. We want to look at how Jesus walked with his disciples. He spent time with them, he was close to them, and man, was he consistent. Wish I could have some consistency like that. That's what I'm aiming for. I was telling you about a book that I've been reading. It's called Simple Student Ministry. It's by Eric Geiger and Jeff Borton. And as we've launched our student ministry, that's a book that has made a pretty big impact on me. It has a lot of the similar principles that we've been talking about. I highly recommend it. But one of the things that they say in the book is, if you look through the Gospel of Mark, you'll see the things that Jesus did with his disciples. And it starts in 1:21. He took them on road trips. 1:29, he went to their homes. 1:31, he met their families. In chapter 2, verse 15, he took them to dinner parties. 2:23, he cruised the countryside with them. In 2:24 and 3:1 and 2, he broke the rules with them. Kids love that. He withdrew from everyone else to be with them in chapters 3 and 4. He took them to other people's homes in chapter 3. He ate with them. He went boating with them. He relaxed and slept in front of them. He got kicked out of places with them. That's got to be fun. He brought them home with him. He took them to church. He rested with them. He desired to listen to them and know them. He took them mountain climbing. He stayed up late with them. He celebrated holidays with them. He took them to his favorite places. He shared personal struggles with them. Boy, that's a lot of time, and that's a lot of proximity. When we show up at sporting events that the kids are involved in, when we support them when they're in a marching band contest, or when they're, we offer to edit their paper that they're turning in for English class, if we sit up late and study with them for a science final that they're going to have, those are things that we can do that's pouring into those kids in a very similar way to how Jesus did. As Brandon talked about earlier and yesterday, connecting is a super critical point in the development of a disciple. If that doesn't happen, then they're not going to mature around the wheel. They're going to go the other direction. So connecting students is the same exact thing. If we don't connect them to each other, to God, to a small group and a church family, they're not going to grow to be spiritual young adults. They're not going to grow to be spiritual parents. So it's super important. The next phase is minister. Students need a place to serve and lead. We have some amazing students at Real Life Texas, one of whom is, his name's Carson, and he turned 16 just a couple of days ago, and I had no idea that he was only 15 years old. I thought maybe he was 18. So that's bad on me. Maybe I haven't spent enough time with Carson. But he's an incredible young man, and he serves in our kids ministry on Sunday mornings. And my friend Ashley, who I told you about earlier, has 5 children. I think she's crazy. but she manages to pull it off most of the time. But one of her little girls is named Molly. Molly's 4 years old, and she's absolutely beautiful. And she's one of my favorites, if you can't tell. I know you're not supposed to have favorites of your own children, but I think it's okay to have favorites of other people's children. That's kind of how I figured it out. So Molly's my favorite, but Molly was in a mood 2 Sundays ago. I mean, girlfriend would not smile for anything in the world. She had her little hands on her hips. She had that look on her face. And I said, Molly, what is wrong? And she said, well, Carson's not here. I said, what do you mean Carson's not here? Well, Carson comes in my class, and he's not here, and so I'm mad because she absolutely adores Carson. So he, at his age of 16, is pouring into the life of little Molly, who's 4, and he makes her world all sunshine and smiles. And when he's not around, she is not a happy little girl to be around. So we need to equip the students to be able to serve. We need to equip them to be able to understand their own story, to be able to share their story with people around them, to know how to share their faith with others. That can be a hard thing to do, but learning at a young age is so important because that's when so many people come to Christ. And if you don't come to Christ in that formative sort of age, there's less and less of a chance as you get older that you ever will. So it's really important because the people who spend the most time with young people are other young people. So if they know how to share their faith, they know how to share their story, just tell about what God's doing in their lives. That's extremely important. We can equip them to serve in a local church body like Carson does. We can equip them to lead a relational small group. What we did up here yesterday is how we do our groups with our students as well. And some of them are ready to jump right in. They're ready to tell the story. They're ready to lead through that. So as they mature, we absolutely let them do that. They are able to disciple those around them, and we equip them to serve in the community. The millennial generation and those that are a little bit younger are all about social justice. They're all about serving others. They're all about helping the poor. They are all about making a difference in people's lives. And so if we in the church can give them an opportunity to do that, then that in turn gives us the opportunity to be around them, spend time with them, and disciple them. So if we're providing those opportunities and equipping them to be able to do that in our churches, then that's an extremely effective way to further our discipleship program process. Serving the community. And then we want to equip them to know what is God's part, what is our part, and what is their part. When I had that conversation with the girls about how fake a lot of the people at school were, we talked about, well, what could you do? What can you change so that people don't think you're fake? Do you need to examine your life and figure out, are you being fake? Are you true to who you are? And I said, can you give me an example of somebody who's true to themselves? And they said, well, Emma, and she wasn't even sitting in the group. And they said, yeah, Emma, she told a story to a girl at lunch the other day and talked her through a really difficult time in her life. And they're like, Emma does that at lunch. She does it on the softball field. She does it, all the time. That's who she is, and we can trust that that's who Emma is. And I was so proud of her. But we talked about knowing what their part is, and their part's being able to share their story or being able to share stories from the Word of God. And by doing biblical storying with them, that's teaching them a lot of stories that then they can take away and that they can share with others. Finally, we need to release to disciple. Students need to be allowed to disciple others. There are a lot of student ministries that are built with a lot of programs. I know a very large church that used to do an all-night party, and I could tell you stories kind of like I told you for the women's dinner of how all-night party got crazy out of hand, and we had hundreds and hundreds of students and several buses full of kids who we took downtown Houston for some crazy all-night, overnight event. I don't know about you, but when I think about having a bunch of students in one location all night, overnight, I just think trouble. And and there wasn't a whole lot of discipleship going on. It was a fun event for the kids. It was a connecting event for them, but it was not particularly intentional about discipling them. But we want to be able to raise up students, not just to have a good time, not just to invite their friends to have fun at some cool, trendy event. We want to raise them up to be able to disciple others, because we want to do that while they're still under the coaching and accountability of invested adults. 1 Timothy 4:12 is often used to justify encouraging all students to lead. But in context, Paul wasn't talking to all of the young people. Paul was talking specifically to Timothy. Paul knew Timothy, right? They had traveled together. They had spent time together. Paul knew that Timothy had been discipled by his mother and by his grandmother. Paul himself had spent time pouring into Timothy's life. And because Paul had a deep relationship with Timothy, because he had spent time and proximity with him, Paul knew that he could entrust Timothy to lead well. So we need to be really careful not to take that verse out of context to say that anybody who's young should be empowered to lead. But anybody who's young, who has been invested in well, who has been discipled up, can be entrusted to lead. The verse actually says, don't let anyone think less of you because you're young. Be an example to all believers in what you say, in the way you live, in your love, your faith, and your purity. In 2 Timothy 3:14, he goes on to say, you must remain faithful to the things you've been taught. So now Paul's reminding him, go back to what it is that you've been taught. You know they're true, for you know you can trust those who taught you. Why can he trust them? Because they were around, they were invested in his life. You've been taught from the Holy Scriptures from childhood, and they've given you the wisdom to receive the salvation that comes by trusting in Jesus Christ. 2 Timothy 2:2, you've heard me teach the things that have been confirmed by many reliable witnesses. Now teach those truths to other trustworthy people who will be able to pass them on to others. So that's the process. It's pretty simple. We need to have leadership around that can own the process passionately. They must be committed. As leaders in the ministries, you need to communicate your vision regularly. Do it often because vision leaks. So you want to be able to talk about it a lot. I told Pastor Brandon earlier, I've heard him teach this material 20, 30 times, and I still love sitting and listening to him teach it because it reminds me of what my perspective should be. It reminds me of what my job is as a disciple maker, and I just love it. So communicate regularly. Even if you feel like you're saying the same thing over and over again, keep saying the same thing over and over again until everybody around you is saying the same thing over and over again. If everybody knows where you're going, you're a lot more likely to get there. You also want to celebrate with stories. This is something we talked about in our breakout session at the end of the day yesterday. One of the very best ways to celebrate what's happening in your church and to measure quantitatively, as Pastor Brandon talked about, rather than qualitatively, is by the stories that come out of the people in your small groups, the people who've been discipled. Life change is incredibly inspirational. And so capturing those stories and sharing them is important. So as your students or your young people learn and grow and change, as their lives are impacted by discipleship, you want to capture those stories, you want to share them with your leaders. It's important as leaders for us to create space for relationships. That's with the young people as well as the adults that we're asking to pour into their lives. If we have something scheduled every single night of the week, and we're expecting them every single day of the week to do something as well, there's no space for relationship. You guys live in a very busy society, just like we do in Houston. People are coming and going, kids are in sports, they've got band, they've got debate, they've got to study because, oh my gosh, it's a more rigorous educational system than it's ever been before. They've got friends they want to hang out with. So we need to create space. Don't have too many things going on. Student ministry is not about keeping them busy. It's about investing in their lives. So create space and simplify so that the kids can be there and can relax a little bit, And you've got to create space for your adults as well, because you want adults to be there to invest and interact with the kids. You want to engage the students in ministry and in mission, because that's going to keep them around. And you want to always operate with great intentionality. I'm going to close with a story about not our students, but some of our millennials that are part of our church. There are two ladies named Cynthia and Brandy, and they came to Real Life, Texas with Amber, Pastor Brandon's wife, because Amber had been pouring into them as part of a women's small group at their previous church. And Cynthia and Brandy are young. They're in their 20s. They're neither one married, never have been married. They're roommates. They live together and spend a lot of time together. My husband calls them the twins because they're always together. They both drive Jeeps, like the same color, the same model. So they pull up together and you're like, oh, it's Cynthia and Brandy. Awesome ladies, but they were very young in their faith when Amber started discipling them. But Amber's poured into them, spent a lot of time with them, and they've become more mature disciples. And it's amazing to watch that. And then since they've been in Real Life, they've been in an everyone group. So it's not just a group of women, it's a group with young couples, a group with some older people, some other singles. And they have really grown and are really excited about what's going on at Real Life. And it's a little bit surprising because it's kind of a small church and we're in a very small community. And it's interesting to me that these young 20s are so interested. Well, not only are they interested, but they're a vital part of our multiplication. Cynthia recently decided she was going to get healthy. And so she joined a gym and she started working out. And there was a guy there who was one of the trainers who helped her quite often. His name was Scott. So she started talking to Scott. And I think he's only 19. He's very young. But he's married to Alexis, 21. Is that what you said? Brandon says he's 21. But he's married to Alexis, his wife Alexis, and Cynthia introduced him to Brandy, so they knew somebody else, and then she invited him to come to church. So Scott and Alexis showed up at church, I think the week before we launched, or a couple of weeks before we launched, and then they showed up again when we opened our building and launched our first services, and people just talked to him. They were very young, a lot younger than some of the other people that were around, but guys would go up to Scott and talk to him and engage with him in conversation. And Scott was really interested in what was going on in our church. And before too long, somebody had talked to him about, hey, do you think you could help with a couple of things that are going on? He's a trainer, so he's pretty strong. So I asked him to help me carry a couple of things. But then our kids ministry pastor asked him to help in kids ministry. And Scott's young and he's fun, and the kids absolutely love him. And so now Scott serves in our kids ministry, and Scott and Alexis are part of a small group, and they're part of our church. And it's so beautiful because they were brought in by Cynthia and Brandy. So this generation, the next generation, will be drawn by the young people, right? They're going to bring each other to church or to small group or into relationship. But then they will be discipled by more mature believers. And sometimes it's somebody in a similar age group, but quite often it'll be one of us who are pouring into them. We serve a God of multiplication. It goes back to the Abrahamic covenant, right? He says, I will bless all nations through you. We serve a God of multiplication. And it's a movement that we can all be a part of. And that's what this young generation really craves, is to be a part of a movement, to be a part of something important. And I'm telling you what, like Brandon said, if we can really harness this disciple-making movement, we can be revolutionaries, just like Jesus was revolutionary in his time. That's what he invites us to, and in fact, that's what he commands us to in his word when he says to go in all nations and make disciples. So that's a great way to do it.